It is a pleasure to be able to speak truth to power. So as she said, my name is Kerwin Pittman, social justice activist, particularly based in Raleigh, North Carolina, but kind of advocated on a few national issues, but highlight a lot of issues and injustices, particularly in North Carolina. And so what got me involved in criminal justice reform is because I myself was a victim to it, not only being a Black man in America, but I also experienced the plight of many Black men in America, and particularly in North Carolina, of going into the carceral system and dealing with the biases within the carceral system. So I also sit on the Governor's Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice reform, into which we rolled out 125 recommendation with sub recommendations under those 125, totaling over 225 recommendations that we're currently in the implementation phase of. And so I'm one of the guys that organized, and I got the governor's eye because I'm one of the guys that organized a lot of the protests in Raleigh. And so my mantra now is from protest to policy change, right? And so I realized that protest was just one way and one arm to bring about a means and awareness to injustice that are going on, but we must see it all the way through and make sure we're at the table when it comes to even lobbying for policy change and writing the policies and giving it to the lawmakers and say, I did all the hard lifting for you, here you go. And so I'm kind of in that phase right now, and though I do kind of help organize the organizers of protests, right now I'm focused on policy change and making concrete steps to make North Carolina essentially a more just place when it comes to racial inequities. And so I have a few of the task force recommendations that are some of my favorite. And like I said, it's 125 with 225 total sub recommendations. So I don't have the time to go through those, but if somebody could please, or I'll drop it in the chat after I speak, the link to the recommendations from the task force, that'd be great. So one of the recommendations that I particularly love is kind of like how we use the topic of reimagining public safety. And so you'll hear nowadays reimagining public safety, and really what does that mean? And it means this, honestly. The United States will train our law enforcement officers as soldiers. The training that they receive is really in combating soldiers mostly, right, for the most part. But we send them out to be social workers. I'm gonna say this again. The United States, we train our law enforcement officers as soldiers, but we send them out to be social workers. What do I mean by that? We send them out to be social workers because majority of the calls that they received, and I'm pretty sure this is across the country, are social related calls. It's nothing about really in itself going out and having to have a gun battle with a bad guy. Majority of our calls are dealing with individuals with mental health issues, individuals with substance abuse issues, homelessness, just social ills of the norm. And so one of the recommendations that I love and I'm real passionate about, and I brought it forth to the task force, was kind of how we respond to different crises the individuals are going through. And those are one of the recommendations. And so we looked at different models around the country, particularly I studied them, from Cahoots to Eugene, Oregon, to STARS to Denver, Colorado, to where these individuals would do right. They have a special team of social workers to send out to individuals who are having a mental health crisis, right? So if somebody calls 911 and say, my brother is having a mental health crisis, law enforcement will not show up unless need be, and it's a violent tendency in it. But majority of these calls are not violent tendencies and become exacerbated when law enforcement shows up and the person having a crisis interface with law enforcement at this point. So what we say, okay, well, let's send a team of social workers out to handle this individual and kind of talk them down back to and out of this crisis. And kind of this is one of the recommendations that we put in place. And what would this recommendation take to implement and can be implemented across the states? Again, I looked at the models called Cahoots out of Eugene, Oregon, and STARS out of Denver, Colorado. This will take a conglomerate of different networks, not only from legislative for funding, but also on a state level, it could be taken through different administrative forms. What I mean by the Department of Health and Human Services within your particular area. In North Carolina, we call it Department of Health and Human Services. So these individuals can help with the trainings and different things of this nature to kind of help these individuals who are going through these crises. Another one of the recommendations that I so love is a mandatory consent to search. A mandatory written consent to search. This is extremely important. And I say this is extremely important because majority of individuals gateway 99% of the time, gateway into the criminal justice system is through the interface of law enforcement. Thus, this makes law enforcement the gatekeepers, essentially. These are the individuals, these are the gatekeepers who you have to see with this interface that will determine will you go into this system or not. So we know that drivers are stopped, particularly Black, at disproportionately higher rates. And where I'm from in North Carolina, we call it driving while Black. I don't know what you call in your part of the country, but where I'm from, we call it driving while Black. And so you'll be stopped as a Black male before any type of individuals, any other individuals are stopped around you, right? So we wanted to put in place mandatory written consent to search, meaning that the individual who was stopped, they would have to give a written consent saying, I give you written consent. The officer would have to get this written permission from this individual to search their vehicle, meaning we will be able to track these officers, these road officers that say, I smell something in the car. I may need to search your car. I smell something in the vehicle. We will have a documentation and we would be able to see, well, 90% of your search, you say you smelled something. It may be something a little fishy. So we put this caveat in place to try to capture these rogue officers who are using the I smell something method for individuals who are driving while Black just because they have a suspicion because you're driving while Black, or they just want to search your vehicle. So a written consent to search is one of the great things. A lot of the recommendations, we put this under the heading of different use of force practices, tighten up on use of force practices. And so we actually put a prohibit on neck holds, ban neck choke holds. We put a prohibit on this. One of the recommendations, another one of the recommendations, we put a ban on hog tying subjects and really laying them on their stomach. Essentially, we put a ban on law enforcement retaliating against individuals for just talking back to these individuals. And so what will some of this take, right, to implement these type of recommendations, right, when it comes to use of force, but also a use of force database that collect these rogue officers' actions anytime there's some type of use of force. We begin to put in place a recommendation to create a database to capture these, but also for them to comply with the Department of Justice here in North Carolina. And it's a national database that a lot of officers and agencies are not even complying with. Why? Because they're not required to. And so we have something that is, they have something that is called the accreditation process. So if your law enforcement agency is not accredited, meaning it is not up to this standard, they can really do what they want to do. Now, granted, you might lose some funding because you're not accredited, but some of these smaller counties do not have the capacity to become accredited, nor the means to. And so this is kind of what we wanted to target, these small rural pockets to where you may have these rural law enforcement rogue officers who just run the town because this is how it's been going for years. And so we wanted to capture some of these within the use of force policies. And so this is going to take a grave legislative push, though a lot of this can be implemented through local policies. And so I employ individuals to look at your local municipalities, the local police department policies, and kind of petition to do a ban on chokeholds, to do a ban on hog tying, to actually create this database, look into this and push these local officials at your city council meetings, at your county commissioner meetings, or whatever it is in your area to look into these things, to implement these things in your particular area. Another recommendation that I'm extremely proud of and extremely sad, though, that this had to be implemented. And this particular one is requiring officers to have a first aid kit and to render aid, right? So why did I put this one in place, or why did I recommend this particular one? Because I've seen a lot of instances where law enforcement, and to be honest, they will shoot somebody or somebody will be hurt, but they will not render aid to them. They may call EMS after they make sure they're secured and handcuffed, but the individual will still be bleeding out on the ground, and they wouldn't even put their hand over their chest or wherever they shot to try to stop the blood. And this is just sad. This is extremely sad. You have the power to take someone's life, but you don't want to take the power to try to save someone's life. And so we made it mandatory. We did a recommendation to make it mandatory for an officer to render aid, especially when somebody's life is at stake. And that is going to take a legislative push, but most importantly, that could be done through a local agency push. So individuals in your area, your local agency can implement that particular policy right there. All you have to do is go to the chief of police, the sheriff's office, the county commissioners meetings, the mayor, the city council meetings, and ask for these changes and really get individuals behind you. And better yet, demand that these particular policies are put in place, because essentially you're saving someone's life. And another one that I'm going to get into, my last one of the recommendations, is the duty to intervene. And this right here could be implemented on a state level as well as a legislative level. So a lot of these recommendations, you can go to different in your local municipalities and demand that they implement these. And this is a duty to intervene, meaning if an officer see another rogue officer doing something to somebody, they have to intervene. It is nowhere, I'm going to stick to the 3 and blue line code and I'm not intervening. No, they have to intervene, or what, they get in trouble as well. And so you could push for that particular recommendation and demand within your city council and your different municipalities. Excuse me, one more, y'all. And this was one that was near and dear to my heart. The task force, we recommended to raise the age for juvenile jurisdiction to 12 years old. As the speaker said before me, it was a 6-year-old in North Carolina who actually had to go into court due to picking a flower out of a neighbor yard. And that, I read the article as well, and it hurt my heart to the core to know that a kid was being entered into an adult system, modern day slavery, as I call it. And as Michelle Alexander so eloquently put in her book, The New Jim Crow. So what we did was put a recommendation to raise the age to 12. Right now, currently, there is a bill that was filed to raise the age to 10. And so we're kind of struggling with different caveats surrounding that, meaning that 11 and 12-year-old still have to go through different screenings to make sure that they're eligible to be able to partake in the process of going to court. But sadly to say, this is where we at, where North Carolina is really essentially hauling 6-year-olds, one of the lowest in the country, that was said, into court, and it is extremely sad. And so that is my experience when it comes to reimagining public safety. And what reimagining public safety means for me from a personal experience means doing away with the system that is racially biased and racially motivated, that we know continuously plague our people, and as well as hurt a particular set of people, particularly Black and brown people, at a higher rate than anybody else. And we know this. We have the data to prove it. We have statistics. We have real experience. We have individuals dying and giving their lives because of this. So now we're at a point in our history. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And so I employ everybody who is on this particular Zoom to please use your voice, lift your voice up, go to these city council meetings, go to the mayor, go to the county commissioner meetings, go to the chief of police, and demand these type of reforms in place, because you essentially could be saving and will save someone's life from a system that was really birthed from slave catchers. If you look at the history of policing, it was birthed from slave catchers. So in the 21st century policing, there's no way we should still be stuck in the same concepts and terminology and really the same system from back then in the 21st century in policing. And so what we're trying to do now is reimagine public safety. And what I'm particularly doing is shifting from protest to policy change. And my name is Kerwin Pittman. I really appreciate you all for having me. It's an honor speaking with you.
All right, Kerwin, you made your case.